The restaurant was everything she'd feared. Soft lighting, white tablecloths, menus without prices. Grace's phone sat face down on the table between them, silent now after the call from the hospital. Her mother's medication charge hit her account an hour ago. James reaches across the table. His hand is warm. Steady. "I can't pay for this," she whispers. The words taste like failure. He doesn't pull back. Doesn't flinch. His thumb brushes across her knuckles, once, gentle. "Money isn't why I asked you here tonight, Grace." His voice is quiet. Not pitying. Not rescuing. Just seeing her. She looks up. His eyes hold hers. And something inside her chest cracks open. "But how did they get here? Let me take you back. But before we do, if you believe love means being seen, hit that like button and subscribe to Love and Light Stories for more. Now, let's continue." The vineyard stretched silent under the August sun. 80 acres of vines heavy with fruit, terraced rows climbing the foothills like green waves frozen mid-break. The mountains beyond stood sharp against pale morning sky. James Crawford stood at the tasting room window, coffee cooling in his hand. 36 years old. Owner of Meadowbrook for exactly 8 months. Still felt like wearing his grandfather's coat, too big, too heavy, sleeves that didn't quite fit. The office phone had rung at 6 that morning. His winemaker, the third one in 18 months, had quit. Effective immediately. No 2 weeks' notice. Just gone. Harvest was 8 weeks away. James set his mug down carefully on the desk. The coffee had gone cold an hour ago. Outside, 80 acres of vines stretched toward the mountains, each cluster of grapes a ticking clock. The window framed it all, rolling hills, morning mist, the kind of beauty people paid thousands to see for a weekend. He'd inherited all of it. And he had no idea if he could keep it. His phone buzzed. Another email from the investment group. They'd be here in 6 weeks to evaluate the operation. 6 weeks to prove he could run a vineyard that had been in his family for 3 generations. 6 weeks to show them a vintage worth believing in. Without a winemaker, he had nothing. The position had been posted for 2 weeks. 0 qualified applicants. Everyone in wine country knew Meadowbrook was struggling. No one wanted to bet their career on a sinking ship. James set down his coffee. The mug left a ring on the stack of resumes he'd been reviewing since dawn. All of them inadequate. All of them. His phone buzzed. A text from David, his old sommelier friend from San Francisco. "Found someone. She's brilliant. Complicated history. Available immediately. Trust me." James stared at the message. Complicated history. That could mean anything. But he was out of options. He typed back, "Send her information." The response came 30 seconds later. A single PDF. He opened it. Grace Morgan. 30 years old. Viticulture and enology degree. 6 years at Silverstone Estate, one of the most respected names in Napa. Specialty in sustainable blends and delicate varietals. Credentials that would make any vineyard owner salivate. Then he scrolled to the final page. Employment status, terminated. Reason, alleged corporate espionage. Charges dropped. No evidence. Case closed. But the stain remained. James leaned back in his chair. The morning light slanted through the office windows, illuminating dust motes that drifted like his thoughts. A brilliant enologist no one would hire. A vineyard desperate enough to take the risk. He looked out at the rows of vines stretching toward the mountains. His grandfather had planted those vines 40 years ago with hands that knew soil better than strategy. The old man had chosen James for a reason, because James understood that wine wasn't about wealth. It was about legacy. But legacy meant nothing if the vineyard died. James picked up his phone and called David. "Tell her I want to meet." Grace Morgan sat in her car outside Meadowbrook Vineyard for 3 full minutes before turning off the engine. The property spread across the valley like something out of a dream she'd stopped allowing herself to have. 80 acres of terraced vines climbing gentle slopes. A stone tasting room that looked like it had grown from the earth itself. The kind of place she used to imagine building a career in, back before her career became a cautionary tale. She checked her reflection in the rearview mirror. Professional. Composed. Nothing that suggested she'd been up until 2 in the morning going over her mother's medical bills, calculating which ones could wait another month and which ones couldn't. The math never worked. It never did. Grace grabbed her portfolio and stepped out into the August heat. The air smelled like warm earth and ripening grapes, a scent that used to mean possibility. Now it meant another chance to prove herself to someone who already knew why she'd been fired. The tasting room door opened before she reached it. A man stepped out. Tall. Mid-30s. Dark hair that looked like it had been combed once this week. He wore jeans and a white button-down with the sleeves rolled up, the uniform of someone who worked with his hands despite having an office. Grace Morgan. Not a question. James Crawford. She extended her hand. Professional. Firm. No tremor. His grip was warm and brief. Thank you for coming. I know it's short notice. David spoke highly of you. David has a gift for optimism. James stepped aside, gesturing toward the interior. Let's talk inside. The tasting room was cool and quiet. Exposed beams overhead. Stone floors worn smooth by decades of visitors. A long bar made from reclaimed wood, bottles displayed like artifacts behind it. Grace had worked at Silverstone Estate, a place that could buy and sell Meadowbrook 10 times over. But this room had something Silverstone never did. It had soul. Coffee? James asked. Please. He poured 2 cups from a French press that sat on the counter. No pretense. No ceremony. Just coffee. Grace accepted the mug. David said you needed an enologist immediately. That's an understatement. James leaned against the bar. My previous winemaker left 8 weeks ago. Harvest starts in less than 2 months. I have investors arriving in 6 weeks to evaluate the operation. If this vintage fails, I lose the vineyard. Grace wrapped both hands around the warm ceramic. That's a considerable amount of pressure for a temporary position. I'm not looking for temporary. James met her eyes. I'm looking for someone who understands what it means to build something that matters. Someone who sees terroir as more than marketing language. Someone desperate enough to hire a woman with a termination on her resume. Silence stretched between them. Not uncomfortable. Just honest. I called Silverstone, James said finally. Spoke to 3 people who worked with you. They all said the same thing. You were framed. And you walked away from a settlement that would have paid 6 months' salary because you refused to sign an NDA admitting fault you didn't have. Grace's throat tightened. Integrity doesn't pay medical bills. No. But it tells me what kind of person you are. James set down his coffee. I'm not hiring you because I'm desperate. I'm hiring you because I need someone who values what we're trying to preserve here. My grandfather built this vineyard on principles that matter more than profit margins. I won't let it become another acquisition target for people who see land as inventory. What are you offering? 3 months. August through October. Salary plus housing. There's a cottage on the property that comes with the position. If the vintage succeeds and the investors commit, I'll offer you a permanent role. With a contract. And a letter of recommendation that will make Silverstone's HR department look like fools. Grace studied him. Guardedness in his posture. Exhaustion in the lines around his eyes. But something else too. Conviction. The kind that came from caring about something beyond himself. She thought about her mother's latest hospital bill. About the apartment lease ending in 60 days. About the growing certainty that her career in wine was over before she turned 31. And she thought about the vines outside, waiting for someone to see their potential. I'll need the contract in writing before I start. James extended his hand again. You'll have it tomorrow. Grace shook it. This time she let herself feel the warmth of his grip for half a second longer. When do I start? How about now? The vineyard at midday was a study in contradictions. Grace walked between rows of Pinot Noir vines with James a few steps behind her. The August sun beat down relentlessly, but the ground beneath her boots held a coolness that spoke of morning fog and deep roots. She ran her fingers along a cluster of grapes, feeling the give of fruit not quite ready for harvest. These were planted 41 years ago, James said. My grandfather chose this slope specifically. Something about the drainage and sun exposure. Grace knelt beside the vine, examining the leaves. Healthy. No signs of disease or stress. The kind of care that came from attention, not just irrigation schedules. He knew what he was doing. She stood, brushing dirt from her hands. The bricks level is close. Another 8 to 10 days for this section. But the acid balance needs to drop slightly before we pick. You can tell that from touch? From touch and taste and 30 other small indicators most people don't notice. Grace moved to the next row. Wine isn't made in the crush pad. It's made here. In decisions about when to pick and how much to leave behind. James followed her deeper into the vineyard. The silence between them felt different now. Less like strangers performing politeness. More like two people who spoke the same language. What made you choose wine? Grace asked. I didn't. Not at first. James stopped beside a particularly gnarled vine. I spent 10 years in San Francisco as a sommelier. Fine dining. Michelin stars. The kind of restaurants where people order wine to impress their dates. And you hated it. I hated the performance. The pretense. He touched the rough bark of the old vine. My grandfather died 2 years ago. Left me this place. My girlfriend at the time thought I was insane for considering leaving the city. Ex-girlfriend. Very ex. James smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. She made her opinion clear at a family dinner. In front of everyone. Said I was throwing away my education to play farmer. Grace heard what he didn't say. The public humiliation. The private wound. People confuse sophistication with snobbery, she said quietly. Your grandfather understood something most wine people spend their whole lives missing. Complexity comes from the soil, not the price tag. James looked at her. Really looked. Like he was seeing something unexpected. That's exactly what he used to say. The sun shifted behind a cloud. The temperature dropped a few degrees. Grace felt the change in the air, the promise of evening cool that these vines would drink in. I should warn you, James said. This place comes with complications. My cousin Trevor has been trying to contest the will. Claims my grandfather wasn't mentally sound when he chose me as heir. Is he right? No. But he's persistent. And connected. James started walking again. He worked for the investment group that acquired Silverstone last year. Grace stopped. Trevor Ashford. You know him. I know of him. Her voice went flat. He was part of the M&A team during the acquisition. I saw him in meetings 3 or 4 times. She didn't say what she was thinking. Couldn't say it without proof. But the timeline matched. Trevor Ashford had access to internal communications during Silverstone's transition. Access to exactly the kind of proprietary information someone could leak and blame on an enologist who asked too many questions about cost-cutting measures. Grace? She shook herself. It's nothing. Just unexpected to hear that name. But it wasn't nothing. And from the way James was watching her, he knew it. They walked in silence back toward the tasting room. The cottage he'd mentioned sat 50 yards behind it, a small stone structure with blue shutters and a porch that overlooked the vineyard. You can move in whenever you're ready, James said. It's furnished. Nothing fancy. I'm not looking for fancy. Good. Because this job isn't either. Long hours. Physical work. No assistant winemaker position to delegate to. It's just you and me and whatever we can build before the investors show up. Grace looked at the cottage. At the vines beyond it. At James Crawford, who stood beside her with his hands in his pockets and exhaustion in his eyes and something she couldn't quite name in his voice when he talked about legacy. I'll bring my things tomorrow, she said. Tomorrow works. She turned to leave, then paused. James. Thank you. For not caring about Silverstone's version of my story. I care about your version. That's the one that matters. Grace walked back to her car without looking back. But she felt his eyes on her until she reached the parking area. And for the first time in 4 months, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, her career wasn't over. Just different. Grace moved into the cottage the next morning. It took her exactly 47 minutes to unpack everything she owned. 2 suitcases of clothes. 1 box of books. Another box of kitchen supplies her mother had insisted she take despite having nowhere to use them. A laptop. A French press that matched the one in James's tasting room. She stood in the center of the small living room, surrounded by belongings that suddenly looked sparse in a space designed for a life she'd never quite built. The cottage was simple. Pine floors worn smooth by previous occupants. A kitchen with white tile and windows that overlooked the vineyard. One bedroom with a bed already made with white linens that smelled like lavender. A bathroom with a clawfoot tub that probably dated back to the property's original construction. Grace set her French press on the kitchen counter. Tomorrow she'd fill it. Tonight she needed to call her mother. The phone rang 3 times. "Gracie girl." Her mother's voice carried the breathless quality of someone who'd hurried to answer. "Tell me everything." "I got the job. 3-month contract. Room and board included." "And the owner? Is he kind?" Grace thought about James's quiet intensity. The way he'd called Silverstone to verify her story before making judgment. His hands, stained with earth from working his own vines. "I think so. Yes." "Good. That matters more than salary." A pause. "I got the test results back. A 1C is stable. Nothing to worry about." Nothing to worry about meant still expensive. Still requiring medication. Still a monthly balance that grew faster than Grace could pay it down. "Mom. Don't start. You took this job for yourself. For your career. I won't have you thinking, I took it because I need work. And because the housing means I can save money for your treatments." "Grace Morgan, I did not raise you to sacrifice your dreams for my medical bills. You raised me to take care of the people I love. That's what I'm doing." Silence on the other end. Grace could picture her mother in the small apartment they'd moved to after her father died. Sitting in the worn armchair by the window. Worrying about her daughter instead of herself. "When can I visit?" her mother asked finally. "Soon. Let me get through harvest first." "I love you, sweetheart." "I love you too." Grace ended the call and stood at the kitchen window. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the vineyard in shades of gold and amber. Workers moved between the rows in the distance, checking irrigation lines. The tasting room lights came on, warm against the gathering dusk. This place was temporary. 3 months. Maybe permanent if she succeeded. But nothing in Grace's life had ever been permanent except her mother's love and her own determination to deserve it. She unpacked her books and set them on the bedroom windowsill. Texts on viticulture and fermentation chemistry. A collection of poetry her father had given her the year before he died. A leather-bound journal where she'd been tracking blend ideas since graduate school. The journal fell open to a page dated 2 years ago. Before Silverstone. Before the accusation. When she still believed that talent and integrity would be enough. "Someday I'll make a wine that tells the truth," she'd written. Not the truth of marketing or medals. The truth of what happens when you honor the process more than the profit. Grace closed the journal. Someday hadn't arrived yet. But maybe it was getting closer. By the end of the first week, Grace had developed a routine. She woke before dawn and walked the vineyard while the air still held the night's coolness. Checked the vines in each section. Noted which clusters were advancing toward ripeness. Which leaves showed stress. Which rows would be ready for harvest first. James usually found her around 6:30, 2 cups of coffee in his hands. They didn't talk much. Just stood at the vineyard's highest point, looking down at the rows as the sun cleared the mountains. Drinking coffee. Planning the day. It was the most comfortable silence Grace had experienced with another person since her father died. "We should test Brick's levels this afternoon," Grace said on Friday morning. "The Pinot Noir on the eastern slope is close. I'll set up the equipment." James finished his coffee. "There's a small event tomorrow. A wine club tasting. 20 people. Nothing formal. You want me there? I want you to present your vision for the vintage. Let them hear from the person who'll be making their wine." Grace's stomach tightened. Public speaking had never been her strength. And these were people who'd been buying Meadowbrook wine for years. People who knew the previous winemaker. People who might have heard about Silverstone. "I'm not great at performance," she admitted. "Good. Neither am I." James glanced at her. "Just tell them what you told me. About honoring the terroir. About making wine that tells the truth." She'd said that to him 2 days ago, standing in the crushed pad while they reviewed equipment. He'd been listening more carefully than she realized. "Okay. I'll be there. Thank you." James left to check on barrel inventory. Grace walked deeper into the vineyard, toward the section they'd been monitoring most closely. She was kneeling beside a particularly promising cluster when she heard voices from the access road. 2 men. One she recognized as James. The other, Grace stood slowly. Trevor Ashford walked beside James, gesturing broadly as he spoke. Expensive suit. Perfectly styled hair. The kind of confidence that came from never having to prove himself. I'm just saying, little cousin, that I could connect you with a consultant who specializes in turnaround situations. Someone with actual corporate experience. I have an enologist. The one with the Silverstone situation? James. Come on. Trevor stopped walking. She was fired for corporate espionage. The charges were dropped. Charges are always dropped when companies want to avoid publicity. That doesn't mean she's innocent. Grace's hands curled into fists. She stayed behind the row of vines, hidden but close enough to hear every word. I hired Grace because she's talented and available. That's all that matters. What matters is that you're betting the family vineyard on someone who couldn't keep her last job. Trevor's voice sharpened. Grandfather would be horrified. Grandfather would have hired her himself. He valued character over credentials. Character. Right. Trevor laughed. You always were sentimental. Just like the old man. It's why this place is failing. James didn't respond. But Grace saw his shoulders tighten. Saw the control it took for him to keep his voice level. If you don't have anything constructive to offer, Trevor, I need to get back to work. I'm offering you a reality check. But sure. Go play farmer with your charity case winemaker. I'll be here to help pick up the pieces when it all falls apart. Trevor walked back toward the parking area. James stood motionless for a long moment before turning toward the vineyard. His eyes found Grace immediately. She stepped out from behind the vines. I didn't mean to eavesdrop. I know. James approached her slowly. How much did you hear? Enough to know your cousin is even worse than I thought. Trevor specializes in being worse than expected. James stopped a few feet away. I'm sorry you had to hear that. Don't apologize for someone else's cruelty. Grace met his eyes. But you should know. I think Trevor was involved in what happened at Silverstone. What do you mean? He was part of the M&A team during the acquisition. He had access to proprietary communications. The kind someone could leak and then blame on the first convenient scapegoat. Grace's voice stayed steady despite the anger building in her chest. I can't prove it. But the timeline fits. James studied her. Not with doubt. With something closer to fury on her behalf. If he tries anything here, he won't. Not directly. Men like Trevor don't take risks. They manipulate situations so other people take the fall. Grace picked up her testing kit. But I'm not afraid of him. I've already lost my reputation once. I have nothing left to lose. You have this job. Only if the vintage succeeds. Which means we need to stop talking about Trevor and start focusing on harvest. James smiled. Small but genuine. You're right. They walked back toward the crush pad together. The sun climbed higher. The heat built. And Grace tried not to think about how easily James had defended her to someone who shared his blood. Tried not to think about how that defense made her feel seen in a way she'd almost forgotten was possible. The wine club tasting happened on Saturday afternoon in the garden behind the tasting room. 20 members. Ages ranging from early 40s to late 70s. People who'd been supporting Meadowbrook for years through memberships that kept the vineyard afloat during lean seasons. Grace wore a simple white blouse and dark jeans. Professional but not performative. Her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. No jewelry except the small silver watch her father had given her for college graduation. She stood beside a table displaying bottles from previous vintages while James made introductions. Grace Morgan is Meadowbrook's new enologist. She'll be overseeing this year's harvest and creating the blends you'll taste in about 18 months. Polite applause. Curious eyes. One woman in the front row who looked Grace over with an expression that suggested she'd heard about Silverstone. Grace took a breath. Tell them the truth. I'm not going to give you a polished speech about what I plan to do here, she began. Because I don't believe wine should be about performance. It should be about honesty. The garden went quiet. Even the breeze seemed to pause. This vineyard has terroir that most winemakers would kill for. 40-year-old vines that have learned to survive drought and disease. Soil that holds minerals most properties spend millions trying to import. A microclimate that produces fruit with extraordinary balance. Grace gestured toward the rows visible beyond the garden. My job isn't to impose my vision onto that. My job is to listen to what the land wants to say and help it speak clearly. She saw James watching from the side. His expression carefully neutral but his eyes bright. The wine we make this year won't chase trends. It won't try to impress critics with flash and power. It will be what Meadowbrook has always been. A place where complexity comes from patience. Where legacy means more than profit margins. Grace met the eyes of the woman in the front row. Some of you might have heard things about my background. About why I left my last position. I can't control rumors. But I can promise you this. Every decision I make here will prioritize the health of these vines and the integrity of this wine. Nothing else. Silence stretched. Then the woman in front started clapping. Others joined. Not polite applause this time. Real appreciation. A man in his 60s raised his hand. What varietal excites you most for this vintage? The Pinot Noir on the eastern slope. It has a structure I haven't seen since graduate school. If we time the harvest exactly right, it'll produce something memorable. More questions followed. Technical ones about Brix levels and acid balance. Philosophical ones about aging potential. Grace answered them all without pretense. Just clarity. When the tasting ended, several members approached to introduce themselves properly. To thank her for her honesty. To say they looked forward to tasting the results of her work. The woman from the front row was last. Carol Henderson, she said, extending her hand. I've been a member here for 12 years. James's grandfather was a friend. Grace shook her hand. It's nice to meet you. I did hear about Silverstone. I also made some calls to people I know in Napa. Carol's grip was firm. They said you were the best enologist that estate ever had. And that losing you was their mistake, not yours. Grace's throat tightened. Thank you. Don't thank me. Just make wine as good as that speech. Carol smiled. And don't let Trevor Ashford anywhere near this operation. That boy has his father's greed and none of his grandfather's wisdom. She walked away before Grace could respond. James appeared at Grace's elbow, 2 glasses of wine in his hands. He offered her one. You were phenomenal. I was honest. There's a difference. Not to them. James gestured toward the departing members. They trust you now. That matters more than credentials. Grace sipped the wine. A previous vintage of Meadowbrook Pinot Noir. Elegant. Restrained. The kind of wine that revealed itself slowly. Your grandfather made this? His last vintage before he died. He always said patience was the hardest thing to teach about wine. Everything else is technique. But patience is character. He was right. They stood in the garden as the evening shadows lengthened. The tasting room staff cleaned up around them. The vineyard stretched out peaceful and patient under the settling dusk. Thank you for defending me to Trevor, Grace said quietly. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did. James turned to face her. I meant what I said. I don't care about Silverstone's version of your story. I care about what I see. And what I see is someone who values the right things. Grace felt something shift in her chest. Not attraction. Not yet. Just recognition. The beginning of trust between 2 people who'd both been hurt by those who should have believed in them. We should test Brix levels tomorrow morning, she said. Early. Before the heat builds. I'll make the coffee. Perfect. Grace walked back to her cottage alone. But the warmth of that conversation followed her all the way home. 3 weeks into the contract, everything changed over dinner. James had suggested it casually after work. Not a business meeting. Not a formal event. Just dinner at Harvest Moon, the farm-to-table restaurant 20 minutes down the valley. To celebrate 3 successful weeks, he'd said. If you're interested. Grace had hesitated. Dinner alone with her employer felt like crossing a line. But the way he asked, careful, almost shy, suggested this wasn't about employment. She'd said yes. Now she sat across from James at a table by the window, menu in hand, trying not to calculate the price of every item listed. The restaurant was lovely. Warm wood. Soft lighting. Fresh flowers on each table. The kind of place where people celebrated anniversaries and proposals. Order whatever you want, James said, reading her hesitation correctly. This is my treat. No arguments. I can pay for myself. I know you can. But I asked you here. Let me at least pretend to be traditional about it. Grace smiled despite herself. Fine. But I'm choosing wine. I wouldn't have it any other way. She selected a local Chardonnay. Crisp and mineral-driven. The kind of wine that paired well with conversation. James ordered the braised short rib. Grace chose the seared scallops. They talked about the vineyard. About harvest timing. About Grace's ideas for this year's blend. But gradually the conversation shifted to deeper territory. Why wine? James asked. What made you choose this career? My father. Grace traced the rim of her glass. He was a high school history teacher. Passionate about his subject but not exactly wealthy. Every year on their anniversary, he'd buy one expensive bottle of wine. Just one. And he and my mother would share it after dinner while I did homework at the kitchen table. That sounds perfect. It was. He'd talk about the wine like it was telling them a story. Where the grapes came from. What the winemaker intended. How patience and care could turn something ordinary into something memorable. Grace's voice softened. He died when I was 19. Sudden heart attack. But I still remembered those anniversary dinners. The way wine made my parents slow down and savor something together. James was quiet for a moment. So you became an enologist to honor him. I became an enologist because he taught me that the best things in life require patience. And attention. And care. Grace met his eyes. 3 things the world constantly tells us to trade for: speed and efficiency and profit. Your father sounds like he was a remarkable man. He was. My mother still talks about him like he just stepped out for groceries. 23 years of marriage. She's never seriously considered dating anyone else. That kind of love is rare. It is. But I think it's also a choice. Every day. Choosing to see the person you're with instead of the person you wish they were. Something flickered across James's face. Old pain surfacing briefly before he controlled it. My ex-girlfriend wanted me to be someone different, he said quietly. More ambitious. More willing to prioritize status over meaning. She loved the idea of dating a sommelier at a 3-Michelin-star restaurant. She hated the reality of dating someone who'd rather spend evenings talking about soil composition. She didn't see you. No. She didn't. The waiter brought their entrees. Perfect timing to shift the conversation. But neither of them picked up their forks immediately. Can I ask you something? Grace said. Of course. Why did you hire me? Really? You had to know taking on someone with my background was a risk. James leaned back slightly. I called Silverstone because I needed to understand what happened. 3 different people told me you were framed. They all said the same thing. That you asked too many questions about cost-cutting measures during the acquisition. That you pushed back when the new management wanted to rush fermentation timelines to increase production. That you valued quality over quarterly metrics. That's what got me fired. That's what made me want to hire you. James's voice was steady. I don't need someone who'll tell me what I want to hear. I need someone who'll tell me what's true. Even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. Grace's chest felt tight. For months of rejection. Of resumes ignored. Of interviews that ended with polite dismissals once they saw her employment history. And here was someone who'd hired her precisely because of it. Thank you, she managed. Don't thank me. Just keep being exactly who you are. They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes. The scallops were perfect. The wine paired beautifully. Everything about the evening felt right in a way Grace hadn't experienced since before Silverstone fell apart. She was relaxed. Genuinely relaxed. And that's why she didn't check her phone until it buzzed insistently against the table. 3 missed calls. All from her mother's number. Grace's stomach dropped. Excuse me. She stood quickly, stepping away from the table to return the call. Her mother answered on the first ring. Gracie. I'm sorry. I didn't want to worry you. What happened? I'm fine. Just a little episode. My blood sugar dropped faster than expected. The doctor adjusted my medication. Everything's under control now. Are you still at the hospital? They're keeping me overnight for observation. Standard procedure. Nothing to worry about. Grace pressed her free hand against her forehead. I'm coming back to the city. You absolutely are not. You have work. I'm fine. Mom, Grace Morgan, you listen to me. I am a grown woman who can handle a routine hospital stay. You have a job that matters. A career you're rebuilding. I will not have you jeopardizing that for a medication adjustment. I don't care about the job. I care about you. Then trust that I'm telling you the truth. I'm fine. The doctor is excellent. Your aunt is here with me. Go back to your dinner. Enjoy your evening. We'll talk tomorrow when I'm home. Promise me you'll call if anything changes. I promise. Now go. Before your food gets cold. The call ended. Grace stood in the restaurant's small hallway, phone still pressed to her ear, trying to steady her breathing. The medication adjustment was expensive. She knew without asking. These adjustments always were. New prescriptions. Additional monitoring. Costs that would show up on next month's statement and add to the balance she was already drowning in. Grace opened her banking app. Current balance, $847. Pending charge from dinner with James, she'd agreed to let him pay but intended to Venmo him her half later. Except she couldn't. Her mother's emergency earlier that day had triggered an automatic charge to the credit card on file at the hospital. $320 for the ambulance. $180 for the initial consultation. More charges pending. Her checking account balance dropped as she watched. $847 became $347. And there were still 2 weeks until her first paycheck from Meadowbrook. Grace closed the app. Closed her eyes. She couldn't split the dinner bill. Couldn't contribute anything. She'd walked into this restaurant with every intention of paying her own way, and now she couldn't afford to cover the water she'd drunk. The weight of that reality pressed down until breathing felt difficult. When she returned to the table, James was checking his own phone. He looked up when she approached. Everything okay? My mom had a small medical episode. She's fine. Just routine monitoring. Do you need to leave? No. She insisted I stay. Grace sat down slowly. She's fine. But Grace wasn't fine. And when the waiter appeared with the check a few minutes later, she felt her stomach twist. James reached for the leather folder without hesitation. Wait. Grace's voice came out smaller than intended. Grace. James met her eyes. I invited you. I'm paying. I said I wanted to split it. And I said no arguments. He smiled gently. Let me do this. But Grace couldn't let it go. Couldn't accept the kindness that felt too close to pity. She pulled out her wallet, hands trembling slightly, and opened it to reach for her card. That's when she saw the statement on her phone screen. Still open to her banking app. $347 in bright, unforgiving numbers. The entree she'd ordered had cost $38. Her half of the wine was at least $30. Her share of dinner would be roughly $50. She didn't have $50 to spare. Not with her mother's hospital bill pending. Not with rent due in 3 weeks. Not with the knowledge that her first Meadowbrook paycheck was earmarked for previous debts before it even hit her account. Grace's hands shook harder. She closed her wallet. James. Her voice broke on his name. She tried again. I can't. What? I can't pay for dinner. The words came out as barely a whisper. Shame burned through her chest. I thought I could. I wanted to. But my mom's hospital bill just hit my account and she stopped. Breathed. I can't afford my half of this meal. The confession hung between them. Raw. Humiliating. Grace couldn't look at him. Couldn't bear to see pity or disappointment or the realization that he'd hired someone so financially desperate she couldn't even cover a dinner she'd agreed to attend. Then James did something she didn't expect. He stood. Came around to her side of the table. And calmly, so calmly it made her eyes burn, took her hand. Not aggressively. Not performatively. Just a steady, warm presence that anchored her spiraling thoughts. Grace. Look at me. She forced herself to meet his eyes. Money isn't why I asked you here tonight. His voice was quiet but absolutely certain. I wanted to know if you'd choose to spend time with me when you didn't have to. You did. That means everything. But, your presence here is the only thing that matters. Let me take care of the bill. Not because you need me to, but because I want to. His thumb brushed gently across her knuckles. Please. Grace felt tears building. Hot and insistent. She blinked hard, trying to hold them back. She failed. The first tear slipped down her cheek. Then another. Not from embarrassment anymore. From something deeper. From being seen, completely, vulnerably, at her worst moment, and being told her presence was enough. Not her competence. Not her credentials. Not what she could offer or provide. Just her. "Thank you," she whispered. James squeezed her hand gently before releasing it and returning to his seat. He signed the bill without ceremony. No drama. No further discussion. Like the entire moment had been simple instead of seismic. They walked to the parking lot in silence. Grace's tears had stopped, but her chest still felt tight. At her car, James paused. "Grace. Your mother's situation. If you need, please don't." She looked at him. "I appreciate it. More than you know. But I can't accept money from my employer. It would change everything." "I'm not offering as your employer." "Then what are you offering as?" James hesitated. "As someone who understands what it's like to be caught between legacy and survival. As someone who sees what you're carrying and wishes I could help lighten the load." Grace's throat burned. "That's the kindest thing anyone said to me in a very long time. It's just the truth." She got in her car. Drove back to Meadowbrook with tears streaming freely now. Not from shame. From the overwhelming relief of being valued for something other than her usefulness. That night, lying in bed in the cottage, Grace replayed the moment when James took her hand. The steadiness of his voice. The certainty in his eyes. The way he'd refused to let her panic consume her. "Money isn't why I asked you here. Your presence is the only thing that matters." Grace pressed her palms against her eyes and let herself cry properly. For her mother. For her father. For the career she'd lost and the one she might be building. For the weight of carrying financial stress alone for so long. And for James Crawford, who'd looked at her worst moment and responded with grace instead of judgment. It was a small kindness. Just one dinner. One statement. One hand held across a table. But Grace knew with absolute certainty that everything had just changed. The week after dinner, Grace threw herself into work with renewed focus. She spent 14-hour days in the vineyard, testing bricks levels and monitoring acid balance with obsessive attention to detail. The Pinot Noir on the eastern slope was approaching optimal harvest window. Another 5 days. Maybe 6. James worked alongside her most days. Not because she needed supervision. Because he wanted to learn. They fell into an easy rhythm. Grace explaining technical decisions. James absorbing everything and asking questions that revealed how deeply he cared about continuing his grandfather's legacy properly. They didn't talk about the dinner again. But something had shifted between them. A ease that came from mutual vulnerability acknowledged and respected. On Thursday afternoon, Grace was in the crush pad reviewing fermentation equipment when James appeared in the doorway. "There's someone here to see you." Grace set down her clipboard. "Who?" He said his name is Martin Vance. From Ridgemont Estate. Ridgemont. One of the most prestigious wineries in the county. Known for producing bottles that sold for $300 and required year-long waiting lists. Grace's stomach tightened. "I'll be right there." Martin Vance stood in the tasting room examining a bottle of Meadowbrook Pinot Noir. 50s. Silver hair. Expensive casual clothes. The kind of man who moved through wine country like royalty. "Grace Morgan." He extended his hand. "I've heard excellent things about your work." Grace shook his hand professionally. "Thank you. What brings you to Meadowbrook?" "Recruitment. Direct. No pretense. My head enologist is retiring next year. I need someone brilliant to replace him. Your name came up repeatedly in my research." "My name probably came up with an asterisk attached. It came up with 3 different winemakers telling me that Silverstone's loss was the industry's gain." Vance smiled. "I did my homework. The acquisition created a scapegoat situation. You refused to play along. That tells me more about your character than any credential could." Grace felt James's presence behind her. Watching. Listening. "I appreciate the interest, Mr. Vance. But I'm under contract here. 3 months. Temporary position." Vance pulled a business card from his pocket. "I'm offering permanent employment. Full benefits. Salary 3 times what you're earning here. A team of assistant winemakers. equipment that would make most enologists weep with joy. He set the card on the bar. And most importantly, I'm offering you the chance to work with fruit that wins international medals. To build a reputation that would make Silverstone irrelevant. It was everything Grace needed. Financial security. Professional redemption. The kind of opportunity that could change her mother's life and her own career trajectory permanently. She looked at the business card. Then at James, still standing in the doorway. His expression carefully neutral but his eyes dark with something that looked like resignation. Grace picked up the card. Studied it. Felt the weight of what it represented. I appreciate this, Mr. Vance. Truly. But I made a commitment to James. 3 months. I don't break contracts, regardless of what's offered. Vance's eyebrows rose. Not even for this opportunity? Not even. Grace set the card back down. Meadowbrook deserves someone who finishes what they start. Mr. Crawford took a risk hiring me when no one else would. I won't repay that by leaving before harvest. Your loyalty is admirable. But probably misplaced. Vance glanced around the tasting room. This vineyard is failing. Everyone in wine country knows it. You're betting your career on a lost cause. Then I'll fail with integrity intact. That matters more than medals. Vance studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. The offer stands. When your 3 months end, call me. We'll talk about your future. He left without further argument. Grace stood motionless, staring at the business card he'd left behind. 3 times her salary. Full benefits. Professional salvation. And she'd refused it without hesitation. James crossed the room slowly. He picked up the business card, read it, then set it down. Why? He asked quietly. Why what? Why did you turn him down? That was everything you need. Grace met his eyes. I made a commitment. My situation doesn't change my integrity. Your mother needs medical care. Your career needs rehabilitation. This could solve both problems. It could. But it would also make me someone I don't want to be. Grace's voice was steady. Someone who trades honor for convenience. Someone who walks away from people who believed in her when no one else would. James said nothing. But the way he looked at her, like she'd just revealed something he'd been hoping to find, made Grace's chest feel tight. Thank you, he said finally. For what? For being exactly who you are. Even when it costs you. After James left, Grace stood alone in the tasting room. She picked up Vance's business card one more time. Turned it over in her hands. Then placed it in her pocket. Not because she might call him later. But because she wanted to remember this moment. The moment she chose integrity over survival. And realized that maybe, just maybe, James Crawford had been doing the same thing when he hired her. 2 weeks before harvest, Grace woke at 4 in the morning. Not because of her alarm. Because her body had learned to rise with the vineyard. To sense when the air shifted from night cool to dawn warm. When the fruit was most honest about its readiness. She dressed in the dark. Jeans worn soft from daily use. A gray t-shirt. Work boots that had molded to her feet. Hair pulled back in a ponytail that would survive 12 hours of field work. The cottage was quiet. Beyond the windows, the vineyard stretched out in shades of shadow and starlight. Grace made coffee in her French press. Strong and black. The kind that prepared you for physical labor and technical decisions in equal measure. She was sitting on the porch when James emerged from the main house. He'd clearly dressed as quickly as she had. Same work clothes he wore every day. Same boots stained with earth and grape juice. Hair uncombed. Eyes still heavy with sleep. He held 2 travel mugs. Figured you'd be up, he said, climbing the porch steps. Brought back up. Grace accepted the second mug. You didn't have to do that. I know. But I wanted to. They sat side by side on the porch steps, drinking coffee and watching the sky lighten incrementally. Pink seeping into indigo. Gold touching the mountain peaks. Today's the day, Grace said. The Eastern Pinot is ready. You're sure? I'm sure. Brix is at 24.2. Acid is balanced. Phenolic ripeness is perfect. If we wait any longer, we risk losing the elegance. James nodded. Then we harvest today. It'll be 16 hours. Maybe 18. We need to pick while the fruit is cool. Process immediately. Get it into tanks before the afternoon heat. I'll call the crew. They can be here by 5:30. Good. They finished their coffee in silence. The vineyard slowly revealed itself in the growing light. Row after row of vines heavy with fruit that had been 41 years in the making. Grace. James set down his mug. Can I ask you something? Of course. That night at dinner, when you told me you couldn't pay, that took courage. Grace looked at her hands. It took desperation. No. It took trust. You could have pretended everything was fine. Could have made an excuse. But you told me the truth even though it made you vulnerable. James turned to face her. I've been thinking about that. About what it means to trust someone with your worst moments. What does it mean? It means you see them as more than their function. More than what they can do for you. His voice was quiet. My ex-girlfriend knew me for 4 years. She never saw me. Just the version of me that fit her plans. Grace felt her chest tighten. I see you. I know you do. That's what scares me. Why? James hesitated. Then stood. I'll call the crew. He left before Grace could respond. She sat alone on the porch as the sun cleared the mountains. Her coffee had gone cold. Her hands trembled slightly. Something had almost happened. Something that would change everything. And Grace didn't know if she was relieved or disappointed that he'd walked away. Harvest was brutal and beautiful in equal measure. The crew arrived at 5:30 as promised. 8 experienced workers who knew Meadowbrook's vineyard better than their own streets. They greeted Grace with nods and quiet respect. No questions about Silverstone. Just readiness to work. James had briefed them perfectly. Grace divided them into teams. 2 workers per row. Picking by hand into small bins to avoid crushing fruit. Careful selection. Only the best clusters. Everything else left for a second pass. She worked alongside them. Not supervising from a distance. Actually picking. Her hands moving as fast as anyone's. Faster sometimes. By 7 in the morning, they'd filled the first bins. James drove the small tractor that transported fruit from field to crush pad. A 20-minute round trip. He did it 6 times before 9. Grace stayed in the vineyard, monitoring quality. Checking that workers weren't including underripe fruit just to fill quotas. Tasting grapes from different sections. Adjusting harvest plans in real time. The sun climbed higher. The temperature rose. By 11 it was 90 degrees and everyone's shirts were soaked through. Grace called a break. Water for everyone. Sandwiches James had prepared that morning. Shade under the oak tree that marked the vineyard's oldest section. She sat on the ground with her back against the tree trunk. Exhausted. Grape juice staining her hands purple. Hair escaping its ponytail in sweat-dampened strands. James dropped down beside her, handed her a bottle of water. How's it looking? Perfect. The quality is exceptional. Better than I hoped. That's your work. That's your grandfather's 40 years of patience. Grace drank deeply. We're just the caretakers. James smiled. He would have liked you. How do you know? Because you understand what he tried to teach me. That wine isn't about domination. It's about listening. They sat in comfortable silence while the crew rested. Someone told a joke in Spanish. Laughter rippled through the group. The kind of easy camaraderie that came from shared hard work. Grace let her eyes close. Just for a moment. Just to rest. She woke to James's hand on her shoulder. Gentle. Careful not to startle her. Sorry. You've been asleep for 20 minutes. Grace sat up quickly. We need to keep moving, I let you rest. You've been going since 4. Everyone else got a break. You needed one too. The crew was already back in the vineyard. The harvest continuing without her direct supervision because James had taken over coordination. Grace looked at him. Really looked. Saw the exhaustion in his eyes. The dirt on his shirt from hauling bins. The care he'd taken to let her rest while keeping the harvest on schedule. Thank you, she said quietly. You can't take care of the wine if you don't take care of yourself first. They returned to work. The afternoon stretched into evening. By 6 o'clock they'd picked the entire eastern section. 23 bins of perfect Pinot Noir fruit waiting to be processed. The real work was just beginning. Grace spent the next 4 hours in the crush pad. Sorting fruit. Discarding anything that didn't meet standards. feeding perfect clusters into the destemmer, monitoring the must as it moved into tanks. James worked beside her, learning by doing. His hands quick and careful. His questions intelligent. By 10 o'clock the crushed pad smelled like fresh grape juice and exhaustion. The must was safely in tanks. Fermentation would begin naturally over the next 48 hours. The crew had left hours ago. Just Grace and James remained. Grace leaned against a stainless steel tank, feeling the cool metal through her thin shirt. Her entire body ached. Her hands were stained purple to the wrists. She smelled like grapes and sweat and the peculiar sweetness of must. She'd never been happier. James appeared beside her, 2 beers in hand. We did it. We did. Grace accepted the bottle. First harvest is always the hardest. But this one was clean. Because of you. They clinked bottles gently. Drank. The beer was cold and perfect. Grace. James set down his bottle. About what I said this morning, you don't have to explain. I want to. He faced her fully. I meant it. Every word. But I also know the timing is terrible. You're my employee. You're rebuilding your career. The last thing you need is your employer complicating everything. Grace's chest felt tight. James, so I'm not going to push. I'm not going to make this difficult for you. I just needed you to know. He picked up his beer again. Whatever happens between us happens on your terms. Or doesn't happen. Either way, your job is safe. Your position here is secure. That doesn't change. Grace stared at him. At this man who'd just worked 18 hours straight to save a vineyard his grandfather built. Who'd defended her to family. Who'd held her hand during her worst moment and told her she was enough. Who was now offering her every possible out from reciprocating feelings he'd laid bare. What if I don't want an out, she heard herself say. James went very still. What? What if Grace stopped? Started again. After harvest. After the investor's visit. When the vintage is secure and my job isn't dependent on what happens between us. Then we talk about this. Properly. James held her gaze. Fair. But James. For the record. You're not the only one who's terrified. He smiled. Small but genuine. Good. That means we're both in this honestly. They finished their beers in silence. The crushed pad hummed with the sound of active fermentation beginning. The start of transformation. Of patience turning potential into something real. Grace walked back to her cottage alone. But everything felt different now. The question wasn't whether it was real. The question was whether they'd both be brave enough to trust it. The weeks following harvest were a study in controlled tension. Grace monitored fermentation in shifts that barely allowed sleep. Temperature, density, smell, everything pointed to clean transformation. The must was becoming wine. James prepared for the investor visit. Presentations. Tours. Decades of legacy compressed into convincing slides. They worked in the same space most days. The crushed pad. The tasting room. The vineyard. Close enough to feel each other's presence. Far enough to maintain professional distance. But the tension was there. In every glance that lasted a second too long. In every accidental touch when reaching for the same equipment. In every evening conversation that edged toward something personal before one of them redirected to something safe. On Wednesday morning, Grace was checking tank temperature when Trevor appeared in the crush pad doorway. She looked up. Kept her expression neutral. Can I help you? Making sure my cousin's getting his money's worth from his charity heir. Grace set down her thermometer carefully. I'm not discussing my employment with you. Of course not. You're too busy making wine that'll probably tank the vintage. Trevor walked closer, examining the tanks. Though I suppose when you've already destroyed one career, get out. Trevor smiled. It's not your crush pad. It's James's. Since I'm family, you're not family. Grace faced him fully. You're a predator waiting for him to fail. You set me up at Silverstone. I couldn't prove it then. Trevor's expression didn't change. But something flickered in his eyes. Satisfaction. Confirmation without a single word. He turned to leave, then paused. I hear your mother's health isn't cheap. Grace's blood went cold. Accidents happen. Equipment fails. People with your track record get blamed. He walked toward the door. Do your best, Grace. though I'm not sure it'll be enough. He left before Grace could respond. She stood motionless, fury and fear warring in her chest. Trevor hadn't made an explicit threat. Nothing she could report or prove. But the implication was clear. He would sabotage the vintage. Make it look like her failure. Destroy James's chance with investors and her reputation simultaneously. Grace pulled out her phone. Called James. We need to talk. Now. 20 minutes later, they sat in James's office. Grace explained everything. Trevor's visit. The implied threats. Her suspicion about Silverstone. James listened without interrupting. His expression grew darker with each detail. He threatened your mother? James asked. Yes. And the vintage? He wants to ruin it and pin it on me. Grace's hands tightened in her lap. Trevor had access to the property. The fermentation tanks. Equipment that could malfunction. Contamination that would look like her incompetence. James stood. Paced to the window. Stared out at the vineyard for a long moment. I'm calling the lawyer. Barring him from the property. Grace shook her head. That might escalate things. I don't care. He threatened you. He threatened this vintage. James turned back to face her. Grace. Whatever happens with the investors, whether we succeed or fail, you will have a job here. I'm not letting Trevor destroy your career twice. You can't promise that if the vineyard fails. Then we'll both find something else. Together. His voice was steady. I'm not letting you face this alone. Grace felt tears building. She blinked them back. Thank you. James crossed the room. Don't thank me. Just let me protect you for once. They spent the rest of the day installing security cameras in the crush pad. Changing locks. Documenting current fermentation status with photographs and lab reports that would prove sabotage if it occurred. That evening, Grace sat alone in her cottage. The reality of her situation pressed down like physical weight. Trevor wanted her gone. Would do anything to make it happen. And she had no proof. No leverage. Nothing except James's faith and her own determination. Her phone rang. Her mother. Hi, sweetheart. Just checking in. How's harvest going? Grace wanted to tell her everything. The threats. The fear. The weight of trying to save both her career and her mother's health simultaneously. Instead she said, it's going well. The wine is beautiful. I think this vintage will be special. I'm so proud of you, Gracie. Your father would be too. I love you, Mom. I love you more. After the call ended, Grace stood at her cottage window, looking out at the vineyard. The vines that had produced extraordinary fruit. The legacy James was fighting to preserve. The life she was building one careful decision at a time. Trevor Ashford could threaten all he wanted. Grace had survived false accusations and professional exile and financial disaster. She would survive this too. Whatever it took. The contamination happened 3 days before the investor visit. Grace discovered it during her morning fermentation check. Tank 7, containing the best fruit from the eastern slope, showed signs of spoilage. A sour smell. Off-color must. Density readings that suggested unwanted bacterial growth. Brettanomyces. The winemaker's nightmare. A wild yeast that could ruin an entire vintage if left unchecked. Grace's hands shook as she took samples. Ran lab analysis. Confirmed her worst suspicion. Someone had intentionally introduced the contamination. The security footage showed nothing. The cameras had mysteriously stopped recording between 2 and 4 in the morning. Conveniently covering the time frame when the damage occurred. She called James immediately. He arrived at the crush pad within minutes, face pale as she explained the situation. Can you save it? No. The contamination is too advanced. We have to dump the entire tank. Grace's voice stayed steady despite the devastation in her chest. That's 60% of our Pinot Noir. We'll still have enough for a small batch. But not enough to impress investors with volume. Trevor did this. I know he did. But I can't prove it. The cameras were disabled. There's no evidence. James stared at the contaminated tank. His grandfather's legacy. Grace's redemption. All of it drowning in spoiled must. I'm calling the investors. Canceling the visit. No. Grace grabbed his arm. We have enough fruit for a small batch. High quality. We can present that. Show them what Meadowbrook is capable of. Grace. They're expecting volume. Production capacity. This makes us look incompetent. Then we'll explain what happened. Show them the security footage gap. Let them draw their own conclusions. No one will invest in a vineyard with sabotage problems. Maybe. Or maybe they'll see a vineyard worth fighting for. Grace met his eyes. We don't quit. Not now. Not when we're this close. James looked at her for a long moment. Then nodded. Okay. We keep going. That afternoon, Trevor appeared at the vineyard. Ostensibly to drop off some documents. Really to observe the fallout. He found James in the crush pad, staring at the contaminated tank. Heard you had some issues with fermentation. That's unfortunate. Timing couldn't be worse. James didn't turn around. Get off my property. I'm just here to help, cousin. Family supports family. You contaminated this tank. That's a serious accusation. Can you prove it? No. But I know it was you. Trevor smiled. Then I suppose you'll have to live with knowing. Just like Grace lives with knowing everyone thinks she's a saboteur. It's poetic, really. She destroys her first career. Now she's destroying yours. Grace didn't destroy anything. You did. At Silverstone and here. If you say so. Trevor started to leave, then paused. By the way, I had an interesting conversation with your investors yesterday. Mentioned some concerns about your hiring practices. About betting the vineyard on damaged goods. They seemed receptive to those concerns. James turned slowly. What did you do? Just shared my perspective. As family. They appreciated the insider view. Trevor shrugged. Don't worry. I'll be here to help pick up the pieces when it all falls apart. Maybe even make a fair offer for the property. Family discount, of course. He left before James could respond. That evening, James went to Grace's cottage. She answered the door in sweatpants and an old t-shirt, eyes red from crying. He poisoned the investors against me, James said without preamble. The visit is still happening, but they're coming with predetermined conclusions. We're done. Grace stepped aside to let him in. I'm sorry. Don't apologize. None of this is your fault. It is, though. Trevor targeted the vintage because of me. Because hurting you was the best way to hurt me. Grace sank onto the couch. I should never have taken this job. I brought my curse with me. You're not cursed. You're being sabotaged by someone who's been getting away with it for too long. Maybe. But the result is the same. Your vineyard is failing because of me. James sat beside her. Not touching. Just present. Do you trust me? Of course. Then trust me when I say this. Whatever happens with the investors, whether we succeed or fail, I don't regret hiring you. I don't regret defending you. His voice was quiet but certain. Trevor wins if we let him make us doubt ourselves. Doubt each other. I won't give him that satisfaction. Grace looked at him. At this man who'd lost so much defending her. Who was about to lose his family legacy because he'd chosen integrity over compromise. They sat in silence for a long time. No solutions. No sudden revelations. Just two people choosing to face disaster together instead of alone. What do we do now? Grace asked finally. We prepare for the investor visit. We show them what we have. And we let the chips fall where they may. And after? After, we figure out what comes next. Together. Grace leaned against his shoulder. James wrapped his arm around her. They sat like that until the light faded and the vineyard outside disappeared into darkness. Whatever came next, they'd face it side by side. The investor visit was scheduled for Tuesday at 10 in the morning. Grace woke at 5, unable to sleep. She dressed carefully. Professional clothes. Hair pulled back neatly. No signs of the stress that had kept her up most of the night. James met her at the crush pad at 6. They reviewed the presentation one last time. The remaining wine samples. The lab reports showing quality. The security footage gap that suggested sabotage without explicitly naming Trevor. Ready? James asked. As ready as I'll ever be. The investors arrived promptly at 10. 3 men in expensive casual clothes. Clipboards. Questions. The kind of professional skepticism that came from years of evaluating risk. James gave them the standard tour. The vineyard. The tasting room. The crush pad where Grace had set up a small presentation area. She explained the vintage. The quality of the fruit. The fermentation process. Everything that made this Pinot Noir exceptional despite the reduced volume. Then she addressed the contamination directly. You've probably heard that we lost a significant portion of this vintage to bacterial contamination. That's true. What you might not have heard is that the contamination was intentional. Someone disabled our security cameras and introduced Brettanomyces to our best tank. The investors exchanged glances. One of them spoke up. That's a serious claim. Can you prove it? Not conclusively. But the timing and method suggest targeted sabotage rather than accidental contamination. Grace pulled up the lab reports on her laptop. These analyses show that the Brett was introduced externally. The strain doesn't match any wild yeast present in our facility. Why would someone sabotage your vintage? Grace hesitated. Looked at James. He nodded once. James's cousin Trevor has been attempting to contest the inheritance. He has strong connections in wine country. And he was part of the team that orchestrated similar sabotage against me at my previous position. You're saying a family member is actively trying to destroy this business? I'm saying someone is. And we have circumstantial evidence pointing toward Trevor Ashford. Silence stretched uncomfortably. One investor made notes. Another looked skeptical. James stepped forward. Regardless of who's responsible, the question is whether you believe in what we're building here. This vintage, even at reduced volume, represents the highest quality wine this vineyard has produced in a decade. Grace's work is exceptional. Our terroir is extraordinary. The sabotage proves we're creating something valuable enough to threaten people who'd rather see us fail. The lead investor set down his clipboard. Mr. Crawford, I appreciate your candor. But investing in a business with active sabotage risks is a non-starter. Even if your wine is exceptional, the operational security concerns are too significant. I understand. However, the investor pulled out his phone. I'm going to make a call. Off the record. There's someone who might be interested in this situation. He stepped away. Made a brief conversation Grace couldn't hear. Then returned. I've contacted a colleague who specializes in family business disputes. He's dealt with Trevor Ashford before. Apparently your cousin has a reputation for this kind of behavior. The investor handed James a business card. This is the name of a forensic accountant who can trace Ashford's activities. If he's been interfering with your operation, there will be evidence. Digital footprints. Financial transactions. Witnesses. James accepted the card. Thank you. As for investment, we're passing. But not because of the wine. The wine is excellent. We're passing because we don't invest in active legal situations. The investor shook James's hand. Resolve the sabotage issue. Document everything. Then reach back out. We'll reconsider. They left shortly after. James and Grace stood in the empty crush pad, surrounded by equipment and half-empty fermentation tanks and the remnants of a presentation that had failed to secure their future. I'm sorry, Grace said. Don't be. They gave us something better than investment. They gave us a path forward. A path that requires legal action against your family. Trevor stopped being family when he started destroying what my grandfather built. James looked at the business card. I'm done protecting him at our expense. That afternoon, James hired the forensic accountant. Within 48 hours, they had preliminary evidence. Email communications between Trevor and Silverstone during the M&A process. Financial transfers that suggested payment for leaked information. Witness statements from people Trevor had attempted to bribe. The picture was damning. Trevor had orchestrated Grace's termination. Had sabotaged Meadowbrook's vintage. Was planning to use the vineyard's failure to legally contest the will. James presented the evidence to his lawyer. Filed formal charges. Issued a restraining order barring Trevor from the property. Trevor's legal challenge to the inheritance collapsed immediately. His reputation in wine country evaporated overnight. Within a week, he'd resigned from his consulting position and left the area entirely. But the damage was done. The vintage was reduced. The investors had passed. Meadowbrook was still struggling. On Friday evening, James came to Grace's cottage. He looked exhausted. Defeated. Like someone who'd won the battle but lost the war. "I can't pay you the full contract amount," he said without preamble. "The vintage loss means I don't have the revenue I projected. I can cover 70%. The rest will have to wait until I sell the wine." Grace's chest tightened. 70% wasn't enough. Not with her mother's bills. Not with rent coming due. Not with the financial reality she'd been carefully managing finally catching up. But she looked at James, at this man who'd defended her at every turn, who'd hired forensic accountants to prove her innocence, who'd fought his own family to protect her, and she couldn't add to his burdens. "That's fine," she heard herself say. 70% works. "Grace. I know it's not enough. I know you need, it's fine," she repeated. "I'll manage." But they both knew she was lying. The next morning, Grace woke to her phone ringing. An unknown number. "Ms. Morgan? This is Carol Henderson. We met at the wine club tasting." Grace sat up. "Mrs. Henderson. Of course. How can I help you?" "I heard about the sabotage. About Trevor. About the investors passing." Carol's voice was crisp. "I also heard that you're the one who proved what Trevor did." "James hired investigators. I just provided information." "Don't minimize your role. You exposed someone who's been manipulating wine country for years." A pause. "I'm calling because I run a small foundation. We support boutique wineries that prioritize quality over profit. Specifically, wineries that treat their employees well and their land sustainably." Grace's throat tightened. "That's wonderful. I'm offering Meadowbrook a grant. $50,000. No repayment required. Use it to replace the lost vintage. To pay your employees properly. To install better security." Carol's voice softened. "James's grandfather was one of the finest people I've ever known. He deserves to have his legacy continue. And you deserve to be compensated fairly for the work you're doing to make that happen." Grace couldn't speak. Tears building too fast to blink away. "Ms. Morgan? I'm here. Thank you. Thank you so much." "Don't thank me. Thank yourself for having enough integrity to fight back when someone tried to destroy you." Carol gave her the foundation details and ended the call. Grace sat on her bed, phone still in hand, crying properly now. Not from stress. From relief. From the overwhelming knowledge that sometimes, just sometimes, good people won. She pulled on clothes and ran across the vineyard to James's house. Banged on the door at 7 in the morning. He answered in sweatpants and a t-shirt, hair disheveled, clearly just woken up. "Grace?" "What?" Carol Henderson just called. "Her foundation is giving Meadowbrook a $50,000 grant. No strings. No repayment." James stared at her. "What?" "We're saved. The vineyard is saved. You can pay everyone properly. You can finish this vintage and start planning the next one." Grace laughed through tears. "We're actually going to make it." James pulled her into his arms. Held her while she cried. Held her while he cried too. Two people who'd been carrying impossible weight suddenly finding it lifted. "I love you," James said into her hair. "I love you so much." "I love you too." They stood in his doorway, holding each other, while the sun rose over the vineyard his grandfather built and the life they were building together. 6 months later, everything had changed. The vintage Grace had created won a silver medal at the California Wine Competition. Reviews praised its elegance and complexity. Wine clubs across the state requested allocation. Meadowbrook's reputation was restored. Not just restored, elevated. People drove hours to taste the wine made by the enologist who'd exposed Trevor Ashford. Who'd fought back against sabotage and won. Grace's professional reputation was pristine now. She received job offers monthly from prestigious wineries. She declined them all. Because Meadowbrook wasn't just her workplace anymore. It was her home. James had offered her a permanent position. Not as his employee. As his partner. Co-winemaker and co-owner. Her name on the bottles alongside his. Her vision shaping the vineyard's future equally. She'd said yes. They'd gotten married in a small ceremony between the barrel room and the oldest vines. Grace's mother present, healthy and crying. James's parents awkward but trying. A handful of close friends. Nothing fancy. Nothing performative. Just two people choosing each other in front of witnesses who actually knew them. Grace kept her last name. Became Grace Morgan Crawford. Independent but connected. The balance she'd always needed. They created a new blend together. Morgan's Reserve. Using fruit from the vines James's grandfather had planted and Grace's approach to winemaking that prioritized truth over trends. It was the best wine either of them had ever made. Now, on a Tuesday morning in late September, Grace stood in the vineyard with James beside her. Harvest season again. The cycle continuing. She picked a grape from the nearest cluster. Tasted it. Analyzed sugar, acid, tannin with the practiced assessment of someone who'd spent years learning to listen to fruit. Perfect, she said. We start today. James smiled. Together? Always together. They walked back toward the crush pad hand in hand. Behind them, the vineyard stretched out in neat rows of vines that had seen 43 years of patient cultivation. That had survived drought and disease and family disputes. That had produced something remarkable when tended by people who cared more about legacy than profit. Grace paused at the crush pad door. Looked back at the vines. At the life she'd built from ruins. Thank you, she said quietly. James squeezed her hand. For what? For seeing me when I couldn't see myself. For trusting me when I'd forgotten how to trust. You taught me something important. James turned to face her. That love isn't about being perfect. It's about being seen, completely, flaws and all, and being loved anyway. Grace kissed him. Slow and tender. The kind of kiss that tasted like promise and patience and everything they'd built together. Let's make wine, she said. Let's make wine. They entered the crush pad together. Ready for harvest. Ready for fermentation and aging and all the patient work of transformation. Ready to build something beautiful from the raw materials of honesty and hope. The vineyard thrived. The wine won awards. And two people who thought they'd never be enough discovered they were everything. Exactly as they were. Broken pieces and all. Building something whole together. If you stayed until the end, thank you for being here with me. This channel grows because of listeners like you, so if this story touched your heart, I invite you to subscribe. I'd love to know what you felt. From 0 to 10, how would you rate Grace and James's journey? Leave your number in the comments, I truly read them all. And if you'd like, tell me where you're listening from. Thank you for sharing this moment with me. I'll see you in the next story.